So, as I say, there are sort of two pieces of legislation. We tend to think about the security legislation coming out of Beijing, but there's also one pending in Hong Kong, as I understand it.
Well, that's right, and that's more related to the flag, obviously, in Hong Kong. But they're both really about the one central issue, which is how much and in what way China encroaches on what Hong Kong sees as essential freedoms, or people and companies, Hong Kong rather, see as essential freedoms that they thought were guaranteed with the handover of Hong Kong to China some years ago, and that they feel have been encroached upon. And that's the question of how far China will go to curtail dissent, particularly that's happening in Hong Kong. So you're seeing those protests planned for tomorrow. You could see those getting quite rowdy, quite noisy, possibly quite violent. The question is just how much broad support is there still behind that group? Because you will see the hardcore activists out tomorrow, but is the rest of Hong Kong truly still behind them? So those protests could be quite disruptive, but they may not be that sizable for now because, of course, there are still restrictions on protests and the size of protests in Hong Kong. More than 8 people equates to a protest there at the moment. But what we really need to try and understand is just how deep is the well still of disappointment with China in Hong Kong more broadly. We saw protests originally last year, I remember, of almost 500,000 people. Are we at the point where we would start to see those number of people coming out again? Or are they simply worn down by a year of protests, by the coronavirus impact on Hong Kong, by an economy that's clearly in trouble and just worn down to the point that they decide that this is what it is?
Yeah, exactly, Rosalind, and that's why, to borrow a term from the markets, has Beijing basically priced this in? I mean, they must have known there would be protests. They must have known that the United States might impose sanctions, things like that. The fact that they're willing to go forward at the National People's Congress, does that indicate basically Beijing's taking a hard look at it? They may not like it, but they're willing to take the hit for the larger goal that they have?
Well, it seems to be the case that China is perceiving the moment here, and there's a number of factors that come into that. One is that there are legislative council elections in Hong Kong coming up in September, and there's a quite possibility that the majority in there would swing to opposition parliamentarians. So they clearly want to get this done before that. They want to also get it done while, of course, people are still restricted in movement in Hong Kong, and perhaps while the world's attention is very much focused on the coronavirus and the difficulties that each country is having with that. And many countries are grappling with questions around opening their economies, how to support their people in this moment, and that might be a good moment for China to choose to do this. They're obviously banking on the fact that international condemnation will be there, but the real hit to them from countries, including the US and elsewhere, might be limited. There won't be the appetite, perhaps, to hit them as hard as they could be affected in other times.
So Rosalind, finally, since the British gave Hong Kong back essentially to China, it's been one country, two systems. Some people think that may be gone now. Is that an overstatement? Are we still going to have one country and two systems? Or is Beijing on the way to saying it's one country, period, full stop?
Well, China still at least pays lip service to the idea of one country, two systems, also because they need to be careful in other areas, including Macau, and they don't, of course, want to frighten away international business, including the banking sector, too quickly from Hong Kong. But one thing that's been interesting in recent years is China saying they don't need Hong Kong as much as they did maybe 10 years ago because they have a strong financial sector at home. Many international companies, including banks, can operate just over the border on mainland China. They've built up cities there that can design to sort of promote the business of doing finance in China. The trade throughput that goes through Hong Kong now into China is minimal. So China has been saying for some time that we don't need Hong Kong as much as we used to and perhaps as you think we might. And therefore, it's less important to us to sort of perhaps maintain a pretense of one country, two systems anymore because we can cut Hong Kong out of the global financial system and it really doesn't matter that much. So that's very much their thinking. They will never at least say publicly that that the two systems philosophy remains. It's important for them to say that front-facing at least. But the reality to many people is that it's less of an issue more and more.